I'm on a quest for the holiest grail. Not much is known about it, but one thing's for sure. It's full of holes, so of course I'll need something to hold it with, something equally if not holier. And what better than an armored gauntlet, one that's knit and crocheted. After all, we are the knights who say, knit. Allow me to turn your world upside down, like the bearings of the Hereford Mappa Mundi, because this garter-stitch glove was the single most frustrating garter-stitch project I have ever had the misfortune of making. Now let us dive into the lore of how this glove actually came to be. It goes without saying that in order to create a wearable gauntlet, I needed to make a glove as the base. And since I'd always imagined this project having too much detail, I probably made the worst decision when it came to finishing all of this in the first half of the year. I decided to forego the yarn and venture into the realm of shiny, mercerized cotton threads in a size 5. Was I certain? Fearfully so. Was I afraid? Most certainly. Any lighter a weight, and there was a chance you'd never see me again. So I'm going to say it like it was. This weight was a compromise. It made sense to use 2 different shades of grey. Any more would have been inappropriate, in the literary sense. The darker shade would be for the chainmail portion, and the lighter shade for the armor plating on top. Once upon a time, I actually planned on knitting the base glove in stockinette, because it seemed to make a lot of sense. The glove was going to be worked in the round, so knitting would not only provide the simplest solution, but it would also make full use of the lightweight thread, resulting in a fabric that would fit almost like a second skin. This was key, because I wanted this project to be as far away from chunky as I could possibly get. The only trouble was that even though its loops kind of resembled chainmail, somewhat physically but mostly in spirit, it definitely gave more armchair than armory. And to be clear, I definitely prefer the former, but that didn't really help me. Until it did. You see, it felt like a no-brainer, but in order to warm up for this nightly quest, I decided to rewatch Monty Python's Monty Python and the Holy Grail for the nth time, although it was the first time in a very long time. In case you didn't quite get the weird references at the beginning, this movie will provide context. Anyway, something I realized immediately, despite completely ignoring it for years if not decades, was that almost all of the chainmail worn in the film was in fact knit in the garter stitch and painted over with what looked to be metallic paint. It's still hard to describe the emotion I felt once I realized this. What I can say is that it slapped me in the face, twice, once on each side. It was some combination of eureka and you don't say. It was so obvious. And yet it wasn't until that very moment. Clearly, it worked really well. Needless to say, the choice between the stockinette and garter stitches was suddenly non-existent. This puzzlingly obvious discovery was the proverbial bullseye I never even thought I could hope for. It was no secret, but it still felt like a well-kept one that had been hiding in plain sight all this time. By now, I'd finally worked up the main part of the hand after switching from circular needles to DPNs, something I didn't think I'd have to do. The thumb gusset was complete, and I moved on to working the upper part of the hand after putting the thumb stitches on hold. So the thing with working the garter stitch in the round is that all the things you don't like about knitting stockinette and like about knitting the garter stitch flat manage to find their way out of the twilight zone and into your cold and clammy grasp. All of a sudden, you're faced with having to alternate between knit and purl rounds, which is usually what you're trying to avoid by choosing to work in the round. But of course, in this case, the biggest challenge was accepting that there was no choice in the matter. It was too late to work these gloves flat, and even if it wasn't, there was no way I was going to. Was it going to be worth it? By this point, it was looking like it. but only time would tell. So these final rounds got me thinking, if the garter stitch looks like chainmail, and chainmail looks just like the garter stitch, then why didn't armorers just knit the chainmail? I don't even necessarily mean with 2 needles. There are several ways to create knitted fabric, one being knitting with a loom. But after some more thought, it made sense that given how hard metal is, this would only pose different challenges. Apart from the potential stretching over time and with wear, the image of trying to work metal like yarn, with 2 needles or otherwise, made my imaginary fingers cry. The only way I could think of it possibly working is if the metal was incredibly hot, almost as hot as the fiery depths of purling in the round, each round spiraling further and further down the concentric circles of Dante's Inferno. I mean, what was the difference? I'd never even read the book. For all I knew, it may as well have been the same. I'm joking, of course. It really wasn't all that bad. What was bad was the stitch visibility, in the sense that I'd made a mistake quite a while back, but only just spotted it. Although, in a way, given one's disposition, this was also a good thing. Luckily, I could just ladder it. Unluckily, I had to reloop everything by alternating between knit and purl stitches. But once that was finally done, I was able to move on to the fingers at long last. Phew. You would think that this was all straightforward from here. All I can say is that it should have been, and it wasn't. The reasons for this were a combination of errors in judgment, unforeseen distractions, the haphazard unpredictability of freehanding, and simply changing my mind. But through all of this, the thought of giving up was a hard one to shake. And now I'm just going to graft everything together using the Kitchener stitch again. Despite the yarn, or rather thread choice, I honestly didn't think this project would take as long as my other ones, mainly for the fact that it was physically smaller in size. I lied to myself. But now, something that would usually take only a matter of days to complete without rushing, had taken me inexplicably longer. It felt like something was in the air. Sure, there were external factors. Life goes on, but for whatever reason, nothing seemed to make sense anymore. Perhaps it was mere conditioning, but somehow the fact that a simple garter stitch project had me twisted in knots like this felt worse than if it had just been in plain stockinette. This finger is looking a little on the small side, so I'm going to work it up and see what happens, but I am prepared to have to undo everything and cast on a couple. My brain fog had transformed into an actual smog, and I was stuck right in the middle of it. Disoriented, I'd lost my bearings. But then I remembered. The course of True Glove never did run smooth. This was, after all, a quest for the holiest grail. It was never meant to be easy. If anything, it was meant to be a treacherous path. And that made me feel somewhat better. Really tempted to just cut these instead of frog them, but I think that would be a bad move. Okay, so none of that actually got recorded. What is happening today? Is this a sign? Let's just say that the irony of this being the middle finger is not lost on me. I don't even know what to feel anymore. The light at the end of the tunnel is beautiful. When you think of the medieval period, it's a given that images of castles and knights in shining armor come to mind. And sometimes so does the Holy Grail. Not to be mistaken for the holiest grail, mind you. If anything, you've probably heard it being used as an idiom for something that's difficult to attain but very much sought after. Before this project, the Holy Grail had always been something I'd heard of a lot, but knew very little about, despite its prevalence in pop culture. And long story short, the Grail itself is thought to be a goblet with great religious significance. Except what seems to remain unknown is whether or not it actually ever existed. There are many who believe it did and still does, with some even claiming possession of it. But there are others who claim that it's entirely fictional. And of course, there are those who sit somewhere in between, whatever that means. Frankly, had it not been for Monty Python and the aforementioned idiom, I would have had no idea of its existence, fictitious or not. From the looks of things, even Da Vinci didn't know about it. And this is all to say that the more I tried to find some kind of objective truth on the subject, the more I was met with names and terms that sounded familiar, such as the real Knights Templar, or the fictional King Arthur of Camelot and the Knights of the Round Table, only to, time and time again, reach a dead end. It seemed impossible to separate fact from fiction, matter from mythology. I was overwhelmed by the sheer number of sources and opinions widely available to anyone willing to gamble their lives away in the quest for truth. Tinfoil hat take, it was so disorientating that it was almost as if someone didn't want anyone to find the truth. It was a research equivalent of visiting the Renaissance fair instead of a museum. There was an air of historical accuracy for thee, but just ye olde vibes for me. Who was meant to be who? I had no idea. Given how exhausted I was by knitting this glove alone, I decided to fold. What seemed clear to me was that I was never going to find out the truth about this legendary object. Maybe I had already, but there was just no way for me to know for sure. Not only was it inherently shrouded in mystery, but it had also been awarded mythological status. If anything, the overt and unabashed romanticization of the medieval period as a whole was the biggest takeaway. Although it was in no way surprising, experiencing only a fraction of its extent was truly something else. Naturally, now that the hand of the glove was complete, it was time to get started on the rest of it. That would have been ideal, of course, except that wasn't the case, because I still haven't figured out what kind of deal a girl has to make for things to go her way. Ideal what? And with who? Whatever it is, I'm keeping it all above board. You see, there was something still bothering me from before.
Let's be honest. It just doesn't make sense. I'm gonna redo it.
The middle finger. And I don't mean in that way. I made the middle finger too big, only by 2 stitches, mind you. But who knew that 2 stitches would make all the difference? I thought about just leaving it. The fit was fine. A little loose, but it wasn't a problem.
I already regret it.
But then I took another look at some of the images of chainmail gloves I found, and, well, it really appeared that the index, middle, and fourth fingers were the same size circumference-wise. Even though a larger middle finger had little bearing on the fit, and even less so when it came to the overall project when worn, it still looked off to me. And given that even history wasn't on my side, I also figured it was realistically the last chance I had to change it. So I did. Oh, and this was my 3rd time working this finger. As the saying goes, 3rd time's a charm, and you can't spell charm without harm. The worst part of it all, I actually got it right the first time. In case you're curious, I just decreased by 1 stitch on either side of the round to get to the same stitch count as the fingers beside it.
I'm feeling much better. Once again, everything is right with the world.
Back when researching chainmail gloves, I looked for signs of how they were generally constructed. Eventually, I came across this image, where the rows of the cuff chainmail are perpendicular to those of the hand. And even though this was the only example of this I found, I decided to use it as a reference for referencing's sake. Unfortunately, I never found an explicit reason for this change in direction, but my best guess was that it draped differently, which meant that the wrist mail wouldn't end up folding onto the glove itself when worn, but perpendicularly, as in to the side, instead. I just hoped that my knitted version did something similar, partly to achieve the same thing, but also to kind of prove my theory. Of course, working this part was as simple as it ever gets, since I didn't have to work in the round anymore. But now I had to figure out how to attach both pieces together, and unexpectedly, that wasn't as straightforward as you might think. And while trying to compute the myriad of things that could go wrong from here, it hit me, yet again, that I hadn't even decided which glove this was going to be. Was it going to be a right-hand glove or a left-hand glove? So of course, without delay, I turned to you to decide my fate. So thank you very much for taking part. The results were somehow both surprising and unsurprising, because, drumroll please, you chose the left glove. On one hand, it made sense for these results to be so close, given that it was a 50-50 choice, but on the other hand, pun intended, it also made some sense to assume that there would be a strong preference for one over the other, given that most people, apparently around 90% of the world's population, are right-handed. Anyway, now that the decision had been made, I could finally move on, knowing which side this gauntlet would be worn.
I've given things some more thought, and instead of just stitching the two pieces together, I'm going to use the 3-needle bind-off, and along with that, I'm also going to use Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind-off.
The reason why I decided against simply sewing the two edges together in the same way you would set in a sleeve, or even just working a normal 3-needle bind-off, was because this would remove some, or a lot, of the stretch. This was a potential problem since I still needed to be able to get my hand through the glove opening, and even though I probably could still manage it, it seemed both avoidable and worth avoiding.
I suppose there are literally silver linings when it comes to frogging so much. So first I have to yarn over from the back, then I knit two together, and then I slip those 2 stitches off, including the yarn over. The hardest part is just remembering to yarn over.
Of course, the combination of the 3-needle bind-off and Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind-off took a little while to get used to. It also wasn't the subtlest finish, since it did leave quite a noticeable seam, but it got the job done, and I really liked how much it stretched. Since I had yet to decide on how to finish things, I left the side open,
because I think it'll be easier to work with so long as it's open and not closed. And I also haven't really decided how I want to finish it. So all I really have left to do when it comes to this knit part is tidy everything up and turn it inside out.
I'm not sure how easy it is to tell here, but it turned out that my previous theory was actually correct, for the garter stitch at least. It folded the way I assumed it would, which is now very obvious in hindsight. If you'd like to see the more detailed version of this process, you can find the full edit and commentary over on my Patreon. As always, I want to give a great big thank you to my members for helping to make all of this possible. As much as I perhaps should have felt a sense of relief, even excitement over finally accomplishing the first foundational task, it also dawned on me that there was never going to be a more perfect time to give up and let go of the dream. Again, I found myself at another fork in the road on my quest for the holiest grail. To flee or not to flee? That was the question. So of course, I summoned the higher tech powers that be in the form of a YouTube community poll, asking for your wisdom to guide me further. I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd only just reappeared from my dark, yarn-scattered lair, with nothing more than a mere garter-stitched glove. It wasn't exactly inspiring stuff. Nevertheless, much to my surprise, but above all encouragement, you came through with an overwhelmingly bright green light. A green lantern that would help to guide me down even the darkest of paths. I no longer felt afraid of what was to come. And so, with my HP restored, morale boosted, and motivation coursing through my veins, I marched on, down the perilous path to Crochet Cavern, and inevitably got lost.
So I think this is the yarn equivalent of chicken scratch.
Okay, so it goes without saying, but I had to start somewhere. All I knew at this stage was that I needed to find a way to achieve a crocheted fabric that was sturdy enough to act like armor. That wasn't metal. Long story short, it was a saga in and of itself, a quest within a quest. And to be blunt, it wasn't so much exciting as it was tedious. So I think now is a great opportunity to talk about the design of these plates, or rather lames, i.e. how I wanted the armor to look. And after collecting images intermittently over the last couple of years or so, I found that one particular pair of gauntlets stood out to me more than the rest, and given that I kept coming across different photos of the same pair, it was clear that I wasn't alone in being drawn to them. The gauntlets in question were these, which were exhibited at the Met several years ago. This rather lethal-looking pair was made by Lorenz Helmschmidt for Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire, who to this day is still known as Der letzte Ritter, which translated from German to English means the last knight. And according to the Met, this was a skillfully crafted personal mythology. Maximilian I skillfully crafted a public persona and personal mythology that eventually earned him the romantic sobriquet Last Knight. From the time he became Duke of Burgundy at the age of 18 until his death, his passion for the trappings and ideals of knighthood served his worldly ambitions, imaginative strategies, and resolute efforts to forge a legacy. A master of self-promotion, he ordered exceptional armor from the most celebrated armorers in Europe, as well as heroic autobiographical epics and lavish designs for prints. Indeed, Maximilian's quest to secure his memory and expand his sphere of influence, despite chronic shortages of funds that left many of his most ambitious projects unfinished, was indomitable. There's clearly a theme here. While researching suits of armor and the men who shoehorned their way inside them, it became clear very early on, even before settling on this particular choice, that legacy played a key role, if not the sole one. And unfortunately for me, the more the concept seemed to be coming together, the more the opposite could be said for the technical aspect of things. Nothing was even looking close to what I'd hoped it would look like by this point in time. I was starting to wonder if choosing a size 5 crochet thread was the first mistake, and despite trying over and over again to make it work, I decided to set it aside in the hopes that inspiration for a better solution would strike. And then it happened. I hit the wall. The wall was a dam, and the dam broke. And all of a sudden, waves of regret began to flood my mind. It had already been so long. I had only just given up on the chance of giving up. When was it going to end? Was it ever going to end? Even if it did, would it even be worth it in the end? I realized in the midst of all this that I probably needed to eat something. So I did. And that helped me feel a little better. If there's one thing you've noticed about these gauntlets, it's that they're spiky. It's probably reasonable to suggest that this element of Gothic design is one of the main reasons they're so popular online, compared to other, more rounded and, dare I say, less elegant looking articles. If you had told me they were intricately crafted for something fantasy related, I would have believed you.
It's not looking ideal at the moment, but I do think it will turn around in a second. The reason why I think that is because this one was my first attempt, and
What stood out to me above all else was how delicate they appeared, although that didn't necessarily mean they weren't ready for battle. In a 2003 essay by Dirk H. Briding, published on the Met website titled The Decoration of European Armor, Briding writes the following. In Germany and other parts of Western Europe, a change in fashion around 1500 resulted in emphasis shifting from the slender Gothic form with its vertical and pointed decoration to a rounded and heavy outline of the armor. Until about 1540, raised ridges became a more frequently used type of decoration, and the surfaces mainly of German and sometimes Italian armors were covered with groups of flaring or parallel ridges, a fashion sometimes erroneously referred to as Maximilian armor. Although it's not explicitly stated that armor in this particular period wasn't functional in combat, there are mentions throughout the essay of pieces that were used for purposes outside of the battlefield, such as ceremonies and festivals. The clear emphasis on fashion, aesthetics, and ultimately heraldry certainly supports the idea that the gauntlets themselves were likely just as much for show as they were for function, if not more so. And as pleasing to the eye as they may be, it's safe to say that none of us would really want to see them up close, if you catch my drift.
And just to be clear, this is the darker yarn that I used for the knit part of the glove, but I will be using a lighter grey/silver for the rest of the armor.
So I suppose the real conclusion is to never let anyone convince you that you have to choose function over fashion, because clearly you can have both. So long as you're willing to foot the bill for it, since an entire quote-unquote Maximilian suit today would set you back upwards of one, insert luxury vehicle. The latter may sound more appealing than the former, but only one will come in handy during the impending zombie apocalypse. I didn't get far trying to find out how much these gauntlets would have cost back in the day. Some have quoted 7 figures in today's currency for a full high-end suit, but generally speaking, it would have likely been eye-watering. Speaking of which, translating metal spikes into cotton crochet was proving questionable, to say the absolute least, and I started to feel like I was just going round in circles. Pun unintended. Or rather, pun intended. Wait, that doesn't work at all. What is this? Punception? All I had to show for all this time, trial and error, was a collection of anatomically adjacent protrusions and slithers of silver crochet. So to briefly run away from the issue at hand, I ran back to the previous problem I was having. Because just as I'd hoped, inspiration had arrived just in the nick of time.
There have been some new developments.
The bright idea actually lay in the crochet stitch itself. So then I had the idea of trying out the slip stitch rib. I'd forgotten how much better a match it was for stockinette. Not only that, but it was worked flat, and gave a perfectly sturdy and dense result. It's also very stretchy, but that was neither here nor there. Even better yet, the surface of the stitch pattern was so smooth that it reflected the shine of the mercerized cotton more than any other stitch I'd tried already. Of course it needed some refining, but to tell you I was pleased would be an understatement. I was elated.
This one is definitely a lot more sturdy. I still prefer the single yarn version. And when you put these two with the spike itself, the single yarn one just seems to make more sense.
Now back to the spikes.
So I've spent a long time trying to crochet the perfect spike, and I think I'm there. And even though I'm not entirely sure that it couldn't be better, this is probably as good as it's going to get, so let's go through it. We have the first one here, which is the traffic cone / witch's hat. It is as close as I think I'm going to get to what I always imagined. It is spiky and square, and it also fits the 2 rivets here. And I think I'm done exercising my perfectionism with this project because this was a lot.
you've likely already noticed that I use some gold-colored thread, so allow me to elaborate. As you could probably guess, the pair of gauntlets you saw before weren't the only ones made for Emperor Maximilian. The aforementioned pair was commissioned in 1490, 5 years after this pair with gold lames and detailing. Generally speaking, gold armor elements were achieved using either real gold fire gilding or copper alloy. Unfortunately, I'm not sure which methods were used for these gauntlets specifically, though from what I could find, other pieces Helmschmidt crafted for Maximilian were made of steel, copper alloy, and gold. To tell you the truth, I liked the colors, but I also felt that the detailing of this older pair translated better in crochet than the far more complex designs of the later pair. To be clear, my goal wasn't to try and replicate either gauntlet design, but to reference and take inspiration wherever it made sense to, partly for my own well-being, but of course to also make sure I had a video for you sometime this year. I tried not to think too deeply into what this crochet portion of the project would be like, as much as thinking too far ahead meant conjuring up all the ways to fail. There is of course the inevitable excitement in the unknown. Plus, if I thought too much about what this would all look like, there's a chance I would have bored myself out of doing it. And if I thought really hard about how I'd have to make the same piece or the same piece just in a different size 5 times over for each finger, then I may have just gone down the mitten route instead. I can't quite explain why I find them as funny as I do, but maybe it's the mental image of big metal-clad men committing violence while wearing baby mittens. And this kind of got me thinking. I think there's something quite ironic about a full suit of intricately crafted metal being a symbol of wealth, status, and power, and not just because some suits were literally made of iron, but because even though everything appears to make sense on the surface, literally and figuratively, it also kind of gives the game away. In the sense that although wealth, status, and power affords the means and, in a sense, the reasoning to even own and wear such decoration, it's also a blatant admission of the human condition, specifically human fragility. To wear a full suit of armor to battle isn't just defensive and somewhat intimidating. It also says that in order to win, you must unlevel the playing field by hiding inside a man-made exoskeleton. Because to be without it is to be vulnerable. And if there's one lesson to learn about waging wars for the sake of conquest, it's to never let them see you cry. And they won't, underneath that helmet. It's said that even the most intricate armors were still worn to battle. But having stared more than enough at the flawless armor of Maximilian I, I found it hard to imagine these pieces, that still looked brand new half a millennium later, ever having come in contact with the odd blade or arrow. Although that's not to claim that they didn't. However, it did make me wonder to what extent these pieces served their supposed primary function, to protect. Is the apparent invincibility of this armor purely a testament to the elite craftsmanship of the time, or did it actually serve more as royal glamour? Because regardless of what it truly symbolized, it certainly served. Suffice it to say, there was definitely a gap in my understanding that I never managed to bridge with research, and I couldn't help but feel that there was something incongruous between the inherent function of armor and the excessive and clearly indulgent vanity of intricately crafted royal armor. Did Richard of York give battle in vain or in vanity? And is it a coincidence that Emperor Maximilian's gold and silver gauntlets were made the very same year that King Richard III lost the Battle of Bosworth Field, thus ending the Middle Ages in England? Probably. These pieces were so far removed from those of the common soldier that despite how obvious the reasons for that were, the image of these suits riding into battle seemed to give an air of theatre. Let's be real, it's not like I could talk. The only thing my gauntlet was going to protect me from was the sun, which is why I had no choice but to make it look as good as I possibly could, which in a way kind of proves my point. The point being a question of how much function is sacrificed in the name of aesthetics. With all this said, I couldn't help but wonder how different things would be if only the battles were won by style instead. Surely that would have made the most sense. Because when you think about it, why spend fortunes on armor that, without the right setting, no one would ever see? In a strange yet very sensical way, it was starting to seem as though wars were being waged to set the stage. Power, land, and religious dominance were mere spoils. Send in the trumpets. But in all seriousness, I was left with a feeling that the emphasis on aesthetics was more about legacy than life itself. As much as royal and noble armors may or may not have served in the field, they have since stood immortal as the decorated, full-figured casts of powerful men, projections of the lives they wanted to be remembered for, regardless of the ones they lived. For us, they may as well be marble statues and busts. Emperor Maximilian's efforts in building his own mythology were perhaps the smartest move in cementing his legacy and thus his immortality. After all, it is his armor that is still so famous today. It is his armor that inspires this project. If you've ever visited a castle, you'll have likely passed by at least one suit of armor guarding the hallways. And even though it's clear that there's no one in there, the suit itself still holds a certain presence. Like the legacies of kings and emperors, the romanticization of knighthood is too immortalized. Of all the things we never saw, of all the things we could never know, even without the fairy tale, even without the knight, there is still his shining armor, literally standing the test of time. For the spiked knuckle lame, or plate if you prefer, I crocheted 4 pointed rounds together before adding a decorative border around it. As is often the case, the idea was simple. The execution was anything but. Not only did I juggle with hook size, but I had to experiment with the rounds to come up with a design I liked. And that was the hardest part. At first, I didn't mind veering away from the original to try and come up with something similar or completely different. The problem with doing that was that it wasn't easy to predict the resulting size of the border, so getting overall proportions right was the challenge here. Eventually, I decided to let go of this approach and try to stick more closely to the reference material, and although this did require a bit more mental planning than in the previous approach, I ended up really pleased with how it turned out. The final border was achieved by using a combination of chains and stitches of differing heights. Sure, ideally I would have done this with an even lighter weight yarn, but it didn't really bother me enough to go out of my way to make that happen. And after this much trial and error, I couldn't have been happier. For the first time since starting the crochet part of the project, I finally felt as though I'd achieved something relatively whole. My only qualm in hindsight is that I wish there was more volume in each of the spikes, but that would have needed more experimentation, and there was no guarantee that it would have looked better or even matched well with the rest of the pieces. Since I was really dreading working on the fingers, I decided to work downwards instead. So for the first silver lane below the knuckles, I basically had to figure out how to work the curved shaping towards the thumb, and also find a way to achieve the fanned-out, accordion-like ridges for the top of the hand, in a way that fit perfectly with the lines of the knuckle plate. But that's not all. On top of that, I also had to incorporate the same rivets that I included for the previous spiked pieces. And now is probably a good time to explain why I chose to crochet this detail. The bobble stitch. It really was that simple. The only difference this time was that I had to create golden bobbles in silver fabric, and even though that meant more yarn ends to deal with later, it was pretty straightforward to actually incorporate them. For the ridges, or rather pleats, I used short rows while working the slip stitch rib to create as much structure as I could. My only concern was whether or not the pleats would hold, but that was something I was going to have to find out later. Next, I worked the outer edge of the lame and attached it to the pleating. However, I quickly realized that I'd missed some of the pleating, so I had to go back and finish that part off before continuing.
I was really looking forward to finishing this, so I totally missed the ridge that was meant to be here.
Finally, to finish things off, I then added a decorative edging along one side. Again, I kind of wish I'd used a lighter weight yarn for this to make it extra delicate and possibly more intricate, but I was willing to be okay with how it ended up. I chose to redo the edge by making some decreases, since I thought the first attempt was too wide. Now that I had completed one of the more difficult plates, I was feeling pretty good about moving on. The next lane below was essentially an easier, simplified version of the last one, so there isn't much to say about it. Although what I can say is that since the ridges needed to be tapered, they were a lot smaller, and I did find working the pleats quite a bit harder this time around. Now for what I'm going to call the wrist plate, I noticed that the original had a spike. Even though this was going to throw things off quite a bit, I wanted to at least try. I have to admit, the pleating had really taken it out of me at this point, and the thought of carefully following anything resembling order was pretty much out of the question. I was going to freehand this in the purest sense of the word. There was no plan, no thoughts, only feelings. Freed from my mental and aesthetic constraints, I made leaps and bounds forward. I even started to question if this was the way it was always meant to be. Somehow there was a method to the madness. There was order among the chaos. How? I had no idea. Even the messiest decisions still looked good. Before I knew it, I was crocheting as quickly as the earth was rotating. I felt at one with the universe. Until it turned out I had overshot by quite a lot. The tide had come in, and I had drifted off to sea. It was time to paddle my way back to shore. I felt the heavy seawater splash against my broken skin, but yet nothing stung more than the salt of my tears.
I don't want to look at this anymore.
But that's enough drama for now, because everything turned out fine in the end. The main takeaways were that freehanding the pattern of this piece was freeing, but it had its drawbacks. Visually speaking, I really liked the directions of the lines. I still managed to get the slip stitch rib in the center, and although the tension was a bit funny in places, it was reasonable to assume that blocking would help if not solve the unevenness. 4 down, 2 to go. Not counting the fingers, of course. Somewhere around here I did end up making the thumb piece, but it looks like I didn't record it. It will show up at some point. The next one was by far the easiest, and I just had to create a chevron in the slip stitch rib and finish it off with 2 gold rivets and another decorative edge all along the top. I then checked it against the wrist plate just to make sure everything fit all right, and it did. Finally, it was time to start the cuff. Again, it needed to be pointed, but this time I was going to work it horizontally. To finish everything off, I then added a gold trim to the bottom edge, and instead of creating a frilled/scalloped edging, I decided to add an I-cord for that heavier finish. I did try and do this with a crochet hook, but honestly, it wasn't my favorite, and knitting this part was just so much easier, especially with the number of stitches I used. Visually, this definitely made some difference, but most of the difference was in how it felt. And that was that. All I had left to do was to figure out the fingers and then just make them. All 5 of them. Or 4. Have we decided on that yet? So the finger names were straightforward. I decided to simplify them and just stick to borderless strips instead. Things just looked neater that way. The difficulty was in making the same small piece of fabric in different sizes 9 times over, not 10 because there was only one for the thumb. And while I got on with that, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about the point of this project, if there even was one. Throughout this journey, it would be misleading of me to say that there wasn't an unsettling feeling about creating something inspired by and based on royal armor. The things that the gauntlets of the so-called last knight symbolize are obvious. Sure, their opulence evokes images of wealth, power, and strength, but they of course also symbolize all that those entailed, such as conquest, greed, and feudalism, not to mention vanity and even narcissism in the classical sense, a tale as old as time. And this isn't just a dig at old Maximilian. His gauntlets were simply the most aesthetically pleasing ones I came across, and that was important. What this is, in my opinion, and the perspective I approach this project from, is an attempt to understand more closely the appeal of beautiful objects that don't fit into our ideas of an ideal world, depending on who you are, of course, but I don't think that needs clarifying. I wanted to understand the appeal from a closer perspective. You've probably heard the term dark fantasy sprinkled around the web and on social media, and whether it be at the Met Gala, on stage during a pop performance, or in our humble abodes, we have been seeing more and more medieval-themed looks. For whatever reason, we're embracing it more, and I think that's kind of funny, because what would we, as the common people, have appreciated about it if we actually lived back in those times? LARPing as fairy tale knights and princesses is fun, and seems to be the thing to do when modern society grows increasingly feudal in the technological and socio-economic senses, regardless of which table you sit at. Depending on where you exist in the feudal pyramid, donning the aesthetic of medieval royalty and nobility can be seen as subversive, even transgressive, in the sense that if we couldn't have had it back then we're going to now. The tables will eventually turn somehow. With all this in mind, recreating the gauntlet of a king through the media of knit and crochet made sense. Handcrafting, as accessible as it is in some ways, is often incredibly time-consuming, and that couldn't have been more true in this case. And in any economy, attention or otherwise, that's a heavy price to pay. Even though it is hard to justify in some ways, I think it's important to value the act of taking time, wherever you can find it, to make something beautiful, for the sake of making it, even if it is something as ridiculous as a knit and crocheted gauntlet. Kings should not have to exist in this world for us to have beautiful things. But was this gauntlet going to live up to all my hopes and dreams? At this point, I had no idea, still. You're probably wondering how I'm going to finish the fingertips, because I was too. In fact, I'd been wondering for a while, because the more I looked at the gauntlets I was referencing, the less something similar in crochet, or even knit, appeared to be an option. Crochet nails? Look, I actually think that might be cool, and apparently it's already a thing, but my thread was way too heavy for me to make it look good without risking it looking really bad. I needed something else, and after staring into the abyss, waiting for nonsense to turn into sense, it finally hit me. This gauntlet was already so pointy. Why not just make more points? The original gauntlets were clearly impressive works of craftsmanship, but there was one fatal flaw, or rather, a flaw that wasn't fatal enough. When it came to the fingertips, there was clearly a missed opportunity. because why have nails when you can have claws? I'm speaking after the fact now, but looking back, I realized how much this reminds me of Halle Berry's Catwoman claws. I just remember thinking they looked so cool, back in the days of yore. Revisiting the chainmail glove, I didn't want to risk the cuff stretching out too much over time, so I decided to keep the opening. I worked a few extra rows on one side and planned to add some metal snap fastenings later on. Finally, all the pieces were complete. It was strange to see everything all in one place, all fitting within the frame. It was a lot, but yet so little. The time I'd spent on it all had long gone. The frogs, they leapt out of the pond generations ago. To tell you the truth, as underwhelming as things were in surface area, the next steps forward were the total opposite. I didn't know where to start. Part of me didn't even want to. Everything already had its place. Moving ahead only meant getting closer to the inevitable. The result. I started small. The fingers were easy, and besides, I felt it was best to stitch them together before blocking everything. For once, blocking wasn't a block in the process, but a vehicle for my procrastination. Silver linings, I suppose. I decided not to pin everything down since I didn't think it was too important. What was important was making sure that everything was set in the right way, especially when it came to the pleats. Being at a loss as to where to begin, I eventually figured that it made sense to at least start connecting all the main lames together. As unhinged as this whole project was from an outside perspective, I stitched the lames together at the rivets to give a hinged effect, which definitely fixed things in at least two ways. Before long, the loose ends I'd left along the way had finally started to haunt me. They say that ghosts of the past can't actually harm you, but I would agree to disagree. It felt a little awkward at first, given that I didn't have any plans on how to actually fix things together, but I quickly found a rhythm and a technique I was happy to replicate. Something about it all felt a little too easy. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. Who knew? Maybe I was already well past the worst of it. But would it all just be smooth sailing from here? Soon enough, all the silver pieces were connected. Unsurprisingly, I did need to secure things in between the joins. I then returned to the fingers. I really wanted to finish them, even if it was just to put to rest the fact that there were 5 of them to repeat the same things for. I also added press stud sockets to each of the gold fingertips to secure them to the chainmail glove. In general, I wanted to use the snap fastenings to attach the lames to the glove, not only because it seemed like a good option to attach the two together, but also because, in a roundabout way, it felt like a bridge between ye olde battleware and modern-day tactical gear. But more than anything, I simply yearned for the ASMR of snapping everything on at the very end. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a major motivator for me at this stage. Once all that was done, I sewed them all to the knuckle plate. Exercising caution at this point wasn't much of a choice. Fixing the fastenings was a long and tedious task, and I really had to make sure that they sat in the right places before repeating it several times over. Unluckily, but luckily, my first attempt did not sit right at all, so I had to redo it. It was probably at this time that I realized just how much I'd purposefully ignored how long-winded this part would be. I knew how long it took to sew in both parts of a snap fastening. I knew that I was going to have to do this many times over. I knew that even if I planned everything down to a T, it still didn't mean that as much as things went to plan, that they wouldn't also go wrong. Fortunately, most things went well, but at the very least, I needed a total of 36 fastenings. That's 36 sockets and 36 studs, so I'll save you the repetition. Whatever amount of life this would have saved me in battle, I had already spent, and more, making it. If anything, this was a battle in and of itself, but alas, I survived. Were the many quests worth it? Yes, but I also wish some things had been different. With such a lightweight thread, with so many stitches, could it be that instead of finding it, I had made my holiest grail? There's something inherently poetic about armor made of knit and crochet. Its very definition defeats its function, but its form serves its other, and perhaps truer, purpose, which is to prove that Richard of York did not give battle in vain, but in vanity.